Lawyer abandons his millionaire client in court, but his employee stays up and defends him. The courtroom held its breath as the polished oak doors swung open, revealing the figure everyone least expected to see at the defense table. A young legal assistant named Clara Whitford, her hands trembling just enough to betray her nerves. Moments earlier, the city's most celebrated attorney, Gregory Madsen, had risen from his seat, gathered his notes, and declared, with an air of cool disdain, that he would no longer represent Damon Carlyle, the billionaire real estate magnate accused of embezzling millions. Gasps echoed off the high marble walls. Carlyle's steely eyes locked onto Madsen's back as he walked away without so much as a backward glance. Clara, barely 27, watched her mentor disappear through the door, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her. For 3 years she had worked in Gregory's shadow, handling the tedious research, drafting endless motions, studying his mannerisms, secretly longing to know what it felt like to stand before a judge and speak for someone who had no voice. And now, as Madsen abandoned the case in a flourish of arrogance, she realized the moment had arrived, far sooner than she'd ever imagined. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Justice Rowe, cleared her throat. "Miss Whitford, are you intending to remain seated there, or shall I consider the defense without representation?" Her tone was neither cruel nor sympathetic, just relentlessly practical. Clara swallowed. "Your Honor," she said, her voice thin at first, but growing steadier with each word, I would like to request the court's permission to continue representing Mr. Carlyle." Murmurs surged through the gallery. Reporters shifted in their seats, pens poised to record the scandal of the century. The millionaire abandoned by his star lawyer, left to be defended by a junior assistant. Carlyle studied Clara's face, searching for any sign she might be as fickle as Madsen. But what he saw instead was a flicker of conviction, a quiet refusal to look away. "Miss Whitford," he said, leaning toward her so only she could hear, "this is career suicide. You realize that, don't you?" "Perhaps," she whispered back, her pulse hammering. "But I believe in due process. And I won't let you face this alone." Justice Rowe rapped her gavel once. "Very well. Miss Whitford, you may proceed. But be advised that this court expects you to be prepared." Clara stood. It felt as though her legs were made of lead. Yet as she approached the lectern, something inside her sparked to life. A tiny ember of purpose that had smoldered in the shadows all these years. She lifted her gaze to meet the jury, 12 men and women whose eyes held curiosity, skepticism, and perhaps a trace of pity. She forced herself to breathe. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you have heard the prosecution paint Mr. Carlyle as a ruthless thief, a man who lined his pockets at the expense of innocent families. But today, I intend to show you a different story, a story built not on assumption, but on fact." The assistant district attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Lorraine Mendez, looked unimpressed as she rifled through her files. But Clara caught the quick flicker of surprise in Mendez's eyes when she produced the first exhibit, an internal email chain that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Over the next hour, Clara paced back and forth before the jury, her voice growing in strength with each piece of evidence she introduced. She demonstrated how funds had been moved not by Carlyle, but by a financial officer who'd quietly disappeared to South America. She exposed the inconsistencies in the forensic accounting report. She even produced a witness statement, previously overlooked, that suggested Carlyle had tried to halt the suspicious transactions months before the indictment. By the time she paused for a sip of water, the courtroom had fallen into a charged silence. Carlyle watched her with an expression she couldn't decipher, some uneasy alloy of gratitude, disbelief, and respect. Mendez rose to object, but Justice Rowe held up a hand. "Miss Whitford, it is clear you have conducted substantial research. However, you must understand that presenting evidence without prior disclosure is highly irregular." Clara nodded, already anticipating this challenge. "Your Honor, I request the court's indulgence. Given that Mr. Madsen withdrew representation mere minutes ago, I was left no time to formally submit these exhibits. But I assure you, each document has been authenticated." Justice Rowe considered her words carefully, her gaze lingering on Clara's earnest face. "Proceed cautiously," she said at last. Clara exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. She turned to Carlyle. "Sir, I'll need your cooperation," she whispered. "You must be willing to testify about your efforts to flag the transactions." He hesitated. All his life, Damon Carlyle had relied on expensive lawyers to speak for him, to twist facts into palatable shapes. Never had he imagined he would place his fate in the hands of a young woman with no reputation, no leverage, nothing but her belief that truth still mattered. Slowly, he nodded. "I will." Clara looked back at the jury, her heart steady now. For the first time, she felt she belonged here, not as someone's assistant, but as an advocate in her own right. Justice Rowe gestured for her to continue. The gallery shifted restlessly, sensing that the balance of the case was beginning to tip. Clara cleared her throat and lifted her notes again, her voice calm and unwavering as she prepared to call the first witness in defense of a man everyone had already condemned. She called her first witness, a slender woman with intelligent, wary eyes who identified herself as Helena Druitt, Carlyle's former chief compliance officer. As Helena took her oath and settled into the witness chair, Clara observed the jury lean forward collectively, drawn by the undercurrent of drama that pulsed through the air. "Ms. Druitt," Clara began, her tone measured, "can you explain to the court what your role was at Carlyle Holdings?" Helena clasped her hands in her lap. "I was responsible for overseeing regulatory adherence. It was my job to review all high-level transactions and ensure compliance with federal and state financial laws. And in that capacity," Clara continued, "did you ever have cause to suspect fraudulent activity in the company's accounts?" Helena nodded slowly. "Yes. Roughly 7 months before the indictment, I discovered a series of transfers, small enough to escape automated red flags but large enough, in aggregate, to be significant." Clara walked to the evidence cart and retrieved the document she'd introduced earlier. "Is this the email chain you sent to Mr. Carlyle?" Helena adjusted her glasses, studying the pages intently. "It is. Please read aloud your message dated March 16th. Helena cleared her throat and began. "Damon, I've identified several transfers that do not match the stated project budgets. I am concerned there may be unauthorized withdrawals occurring under Project Code 493B. We need to review this immediately." Clara turned to the jury. "And how did Mr. Carlyle respond?" "He asked me to prepare a detailed report," Helena said. "I sent it to him and to Mr. Halvorson, the CFO. Did Mr. Carlyle give any instructions after receiving your report?" Helena's eyes flickered to Damon Carlyle, then back to Clara. "He directed me to begin an internal audit and to freeze discretionary spending on all accounts linked to Project 493B. Clara's heart thumped with quiet triumph. She could sense the jurors weighing this revelation against the prosecution's narrative of Carlyle as a self-serving predator. "Ms. Druitt," she said, softening her tone, "did Mr. Carlyle ever attempt to conceal your findings?" "No," Helena replied at once. "He took them seriously." Clara nodded. "Thank you. No further questions." As Helena stepped down, Mendez rose, her expression tight with irritation. "Ms. Druitt," she began, "is it true you resigned from Carlyle Holdings shortly before the indictment?" "I did," Helena admitted. "Would you describe your resignation as voluntary?" Helena paused, her gaze steady. "No. I was asked to leave." "Because you failed to detect the fraud earlier?" "Because I refused to sign off on the quarterly reports," Helena clarified. A ripple of surprise coursed through the room. Clara made herself stand perfectly still, willing the jury to understand that this, too, supported her argument. Carlyle had trusted Helena to uncover the truth, even when it brought discomfort and disruption. Mendez attempted a few more questions, but Helena remained composed, her answers consistent. Finally, the prosecutor waved her away with a curt nod. Justice Rowe glanced at Clara. "Your next witness?" Clara called Mr. Carlyle himself. He rose slowly, as though weighed down by the months of accusations and the sudden loss of his high-priced defender. But when he reached the witness chair, Clara noticed a subtle shift in his bearing. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, a faint spark of defiance in his eyes. She waited while he was sworn in, then approached with deliberate calm. "Mr. Carlyle," she began, "you've heard testimony suggesting you attempted to investigate irregularities in your company's accounts. Is that true?" "It is," he replied in a low voice that carried across the silent courtroom. "Did you, at any time, authorize the misappropriation of funds?" "No." "Did you benefit personally from the transfers linked to Project 493B?" "No." "Then why, in your opinion, have you been charged with embezzlement?" Carlyle drew a long breath. "Because when you run a large company, you are responsible for everything that happens under your leadership, even if you don't know it's happening. My mistake was trusting Halvorson completely." Clara felt the jurors watching him, gauging the authenticity of his regret. She pressed on. Did you ever instruct Ms. Druitt or any other employee to falsify records? Never, Carlyle said, his voice gaining firmness. When Helena brought me her findings, I acted immediately. Yet your own lawyer, Mr. Madsen, told the press you were guilty. Why do you think he abandoned your defense? Carlyle's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. Because he believed I'd be convicted. And he was more concerned about protecting his reputation than about protecting my rights. The honesty in his tone startled even Clara. For the first time since she'd met him, he sounded like a man willing to stand naked before judgment rather than hide behind expensive counsel. No further questions, Clara said quietly. Justice Rowe looked to Mendez. Cross-examination. Mendez rose, but her arguments had lost some of their earlier venom. She probed Carlyle's awareness of the transfers, his communication gaps with his CFO, the timing of his audit. He answered calmly, never wavering in his insistence that he had tried to stop the fraud as soon as it was discovered. When Mendez finally sat down, Clara glanced at the clock, realizing hours had passed in what felt like minutes. The jurors looked tired but riveted. She knew she had to strike while their attention remained unbroken. She returned to the lectern and began her closing argument, her voice clear and resonant. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen that Mr. Carlyle made mistakes. But making mistakes is not a crime. Trusting the wrong people is not a crime. The prosecution has asked you to convict a man based on the assumption that wealth and guilt are the same thing. But assumptions are not evidence. Her gaze swept the room, meeting each juror's eyes in turn. I am asking you to look beyond rumor and reputation, to weigh only what you have heard and seen in this courtroom. As she spoke, she felt something she had never known before, something electric and undeniable. She was not standing in the shadow of anyone. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The final day of the trial dawned under a gray sky, as if the heavens themselves held their breath in anticipation. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse like crows over fresh tension, flashing cameras and shouting questions, but inside the courtroom, there was a different kind of storm brewing, silent, electric, and crackling beneath every glance and whispered word. The jury had deliberated for nearly 10 hours the night before, and now, as they filed back into their seats, every eye in the room turned to Clara. She sat alone at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the worn surface, her gaze unwavering. Damon Carlyle sat beside her, composed but not indifferent, his pride stripped away and replaced with a quiet humility that had not been there before. He no longer looked like the untouchable billionaire that once towered over boardrooms. He looked like a man who had faced the worst storm of his life and somehow emerged with his soul intact. Justice Rowe's entrance brought the room to a hush so complete it seemed even time itself paused. The jury foreman rose, a slip of paper clutched in his hand. He handed it to the bailiff, who walked it to the judge with the gravity of a man delivering fate. The judge read the verdict in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she lifted her eyes and spoke. In the matter of the People versus Damon Carlyle, on the charge of embezzlement and corporate fraud, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. The words exploded in the room like a cannon blast. A tidal wave of gasps, tears, and disbelief surged through the spectators. Mendez's pen dropped from her hand. Reporters scrambled to dial into their networks. And Clara remained still for just one moment longer, frozen in the surreal clarity of triumph. Then Damon turned to her, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You saved my life." But it wasn't only his voice that cracked. It was something deeper, something ancient. For the first time in his powerful, opulent life, Damon Carlyle had placed his future not in the hands of wealth or influence, but in the hands of a woman who had nothing to gain except the belief that the truth was worth fighting for. And she had done the unthinkable. She had won. Justice Rowe banged her gavel once to restore order. This court thanks the jury for its service. Mr. Carlyle, you are free to go. The bailiffs opened the chamber doors as the courtroom erupted with noise. But Clara didn't move. She stared at her trembling hands, the realization of what she had accomplished only beginning to settle into her bones. She had stood before a court as a complete unknown, faced off against one of the toughest prosecutors in the state, and defended a man everyone had already condemned. But it wasn't the victory alone that struck her. It was the journey. The cold nights reviewing evidence alone, the tremors of doubt, the whispers of scandal, and most of all, the moment when she could have walked away, and didn't. Damon turned to her again. "What's next for you?" Clara looked up, her eyes clear, her voice strong. "I'm going to law school." And then, courtrooms like this one won't scare me anymore. He smiled, then did something unexpected. He stood, walked to the front of the courtroom where cameras still flickered, and raised his hand. "Before you ask your questions," he said to the reporters, "I have one thing to say. I was not saved by a great firm or a powerful name. I was saved by a woman you've never heard of, Clara Whitford. Remember her name, because someday it will stand for justice." The world listened. For a moment, the internet forgot the scandal and focused on the story of a young assistant who did what giants would not. Her name trended in hours. Law firms called within days. Scholarships poured in from universities that had once ignored her applications. And those who had doubted her, who had dismissed her, stood silently as Clara took her first true steps into the light of the career she had always dreamed of. But Clara didn't change overnight. She remained grounded, focused, and fiercely passionate about using her voice for those without one. In every courtroom she entered thereafter, she remembered that case, that moment, that day she stood alone, and won. Years later, a bronze plaque would hang in the hallway of the state courthouse, inscribed with words that would echo in legal circles for generations. In a room full of silence, one voice changed the verdict. Clara Whitford, truth's unlikely champion. The trial that was meant to ruin Damon Carlyle became the trial that built Clara Whitford. Not through power or prestige, but through courage, through fire, through belief. And that, in the end, was what justice truly looked like.